Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Abby Shermer, and this is part 3 of your counterplan lecture series. In this part, we will be covering the best ways to extend a counterplan in the negative block. If you haven't yet, go and watch parts 1 on reviewing the basics and part 2 on answering counterplans before you watch this video. As a reminder, feel free to take breaks to reduce fatigue and ensure you're actually paying attention. You can also rewatch parts of this lecture series that might be a bit confusing. Finally, I've created a notes document attached to this video series you can use to take notes or write down questions. Any questions you do have, you can send to me via email at abby.shermer@gmail.com, and I'll be able to answer any questions that you might have. Let's get started. Extending a counterplan in the block is not complicated. Negative teams should start with an overview explaining what the counterplan does and how the counterplan solves the affirmative's advantages. The negative team can also use the overview for framing questions. A common framing question is sufficiency. Negative teams may make the argument that the counterplan sufficiently solves the affirmative, which means that it might not be perfect, but it's good enough to get the job done. Overviews should be short, given that most of the debating will actually take place on the line by line. When you move into the responding to the 2AC portion or the line by line, ensure that you're sticking to the 2AC order to stay organized and not anger your judges. Judges love when you respond in the same order that the 2AC did, just so you don't drop arguments or miss arguments or mess up everyone's flows. Let's now focus on how negative teams should respond to common affirmative arguments on the line by line. Starting with the permutation, first, remember there are several types of permutations, so make sure you know exactly which permutations the affirmative team read in the debate. You can do this by double checking in the cross-X which permutations were read. There is a perm you do not understand. This is also a great time to ask about it. You should not feel embarrassed or nervous or scared to ask a question about the permutation. If it seems complicated to you, it's probably also going to be confusing to the judge. So asking questions about it do not make you look behind or, dumb or silly or anything like that. To answer permutation do both, you first want to make an argument that this permutation links to the disadvantage presented in the debate. Because counterplans typically are presented to solve the AF without linking to the disadvantage, the permutation, which includes all of the AF, would still link. Negative teams should also make arguments why this permutation would fail, because doing so would cause confusion or some other logistical set of problems. To answer another common perm do the counterplan, you need to debate the competition of the counterplan. In part 2, we discussed that the argument the affirmative is making when they say perm do the counterplan. If you need a refresher on this, go back and rewatch part 2. Perm do the counterplan is an argument that challenges whether the counterplan is competitive with the affirmative. The affirmative isn't arguing that we should just do the counterplan, but that the counterplan and the plan are so similar or not distinct from one another, there's no benefit to doing the counterplan over the plan. It is this portion of the debate that the negative team must explain or read evidence to prove why the counterplan is distinct. This typically goes along with reading cards that define words in the resolution or reading evidence that really clearly delineates what's the difference between the plan and counterplan. The second set of arguments that an affirmative team may make against the counterplan is offense. This can either be in the form of a disadvantage to your counterplan's action or can be add-ons to the affirmative that the counterplan does not solve. Against add-ons, you want to make sure that you both attempt to make the counterplan solve the add-on or read additional defense against them. Additionally, if you do end up kicking the counterplan either in the block or later in the debate, you have to still answer the add-ons. Failure to do so means that the affirmative will get a new little advantage that they can pull off the counterplan flow and use to outweigh your disadds or other arguments in the debate. Against any other offense, like arguments as to why your counterplan action might be a bad idea, negative teams just need to be prepared to defend the action that the counterplan takes. The next set of arguments the affirmative can make is theory arguments. This questions the legitimacy or theoretical legitimacy of the counterplan. Affirmative teams can argue that the counterplan is theoretically illegitimate in two ways. Both of these we covered in part 2. Either they can challenge the status of the counterplan or the type of counterplan. We're going to discuss theory in greater detail in the next part of this lecture series, but you should do whatever you can to ensure that you answer theory in the negative block. Failure to do so will definitely cost you the counterplan and potentially the entire debate. Finally, affirmative teams are going to make solvency deficits against your counterplan. They will say the counterplan does not solve the advantages to the affirmative. In this section of your speech, you should be as specific as possible and read as much evidence as you need to prove that you actually do solve those advantages. While you have already explained how the counterplan works in the overview, it's this section of the debate where you should explain in detail how the counterplan solves each advantage. Don't just assume that your judge is going to kind of understand what's going on with that. You want to be specific and go advantage by advantage, explaining why you achieve the same results as the affirmative. Just a reminder, the affirmative team may not make all of these arguments in this order. They may not make them at all. They may make only some, but not the others. And they may make multiple types of each argument. The negative must remember to answer all of the 2AC arguments in order that they made them. Follow the line by line. So you may not be able to respond to the counterplan in the exact way that I just laid out, but just know those four types of arguments are the types of arguments that they will probably be making. In the final part of this portion of the lecture series, I want to focus on the top tips for extending a counterplan in the negative block. Tip number 1 is to put the counterplan in the 2NC. When thinking about how you and your partner will split up the negative block, consider which arguments are going to take the most amount of time for the 2NC to prep. Think about giving a negative block, right? The 2NC takes prep before their speech and before the negative block begins. The 1NR has tons of time to prep, right? They have all of the 2NC's prep time, all of the 2NC, all of the cross-X, and then finally it's their time to speak. So we want to maximize the amount of prep time that the 2NC has left over. They want to use as little as possible before that speech. So if we put the counterplan in the 2NC, counterplans tend to be less prep intensive, meaning they're quicker to prep, easier to prep, and give the more prep intensive arguments to the 1NR. The counterplan tends to be less prep intensive, so it should go in the 2NC. My second tip is to keep your overview short and sweet. No one likes a long overview, especially one that makes all the same arguments that you should be making on the line by line. You want to explain what the counterplan does, briefly how it solves, and any framing arguments for the debate. Then move on to the line by line. Tip number 3 is to pre-prep the counterplan. If this is a counterplan you want to read in a number of debates, you want to read it consistently throughout the course of the year, it makes sense to have a few materials pre-prepared to debate with. I recommend pre-making your overview to explain what the counterplan does, but then leave a little bit of modular space or space left over where you can put in specifically how this counterplan solves the affirmative advantages in the debate that you are actually having. This will change from debate to debate. In addition, you typically make the same set of arguments versus the permutation, versus common solvency deficits, and versus theory arguments. So it's good to have those things pre-prepared in advance. Again, this makes the preparation for a counterplan in the 2NC super quick, which means it helps maximize the amount that you can do with the prep time you are given. Tip number 4 is you want to make sure you understand the arguments the affirmative made. This kind of sounds like a no duh, but affirmative teams sometimes make complicated permutation arguments or complicated theory or solvency deficit arguments against the counterplan. Instead of just assuming that you know what they are saying, you should take time in cross-X to ask questions. You should not stop cross-X or stop asking questions until you understand all of the solvency deficits and all of the permutations. It's also a really good idea to use that cross-X time to ask about theory. You might have to investigate, ask follow-up questions on this, and read their evidence. But once you have a solid understanding of their arguments, you can better craft your responses on the counterplan. Do not take any of these arguments for granted. Oh yeah, I know what they're saying here. You might not. So double check, read their evidence, ask questions so that you can accurately answer some of the solvency deficits. Time and time again, negative teams will blow off affirmative solvency deficit arguments thinking they know what it is, but then it shifts or morphs into something totally different later. You want to nail the affirmative down in cross-X of the 2AC on what exactly their solvency deficits are, or what their permutations are so you can hold them to that explanation later on. It makes it easier then in the 2NR for you to be like, no, their solvency deficit was this in the 2AC. We cross-exed about it. That's the solvency deficit I answered. They can't just shift and make up some new arguments in the 1AR. The last tip, or the most important tip of all, is do not forget to answer theory. If you do not answer theory, it makes it true, and you will likely lose the counterplan or the full debate. You have to do whatever you can to make sure you remember to answer it. This could mean you circle it on your flow, you star it, or you highlight it. You can also double check and cross-X what theory arguments were made so you will not forget them. Thank you so much for watching part 3 of this lecture series. In part 4, we're going to discuss counterplan theory in greater detail. Remember, you can always go back and rewatch parts of this lecture series you found confusing or didn't understand the first time, and can also send me an email with questions you have.